Hey, everyone. Welcome to Locked On Lakers for Thursday. Brian Kamenetsky, Andy Kamenetsky. Andy, Wednesday's show with Dan Woike was so good, we needed to chop it up into two. The second half of our conversation with the LA Times beat writer, Lakers beat writer Dan Woike, that's next on Locked On Lakers.
You are Locked On Lakers, your daily Los Angeles Lakers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks to everybody for making Locked On Lakers your first listen of every day, Monday through Friday. Sometimes on weekends, we get this thing up as early as we can for you. Always fresh Lakers content, and particularly on the Locked On Lakers YouTube page, where the video podcast, Andy, all this appears before you get the audio version. Really want to encourage people to go back and listen to Wednesday's show. The first half of our interview with Dan Woike of the LA Times covers the Lakers there. Really great stuff on Russell Westbrook and Rob Pelinka and accountability. But it was such a great conversation. We needed to stretch it out into two episodes. And we pick it up here talking about the coaching search and me pointing out another issue that the Lakers are going to run into when it comes to getting the guy that they want. The other part of this, though, is that they're cheap. Like they you talk about
controlling too, by the way.
That's a great combination. Is we're not going to pay you that much, but we're also going to dictate all the terms of who's on your staff, and we're going to have Kurt looking over your shoulder, and possibly Linda. We're not, and maybe we'll ask more clarification on that in a second. Ultimately, the reason they don't have Ty Lue is they didn't want to pay for Ty Lue.
Years and dollars. Yep.
You would know better than me why they don't have Monty Williams exactly, but Williams clearly chose Phoenix in the situation they had there over what they had in LA for different reasons. And you feel free to
when you get the chance to work for Robert Sarver, you jump.
That is absolutely true. I mean, Andy and I both saw that as a scathing indictment of what had gone on. Like he volunteered to go work for Phoenix as opposed to the Lakers. And they, like you said, they lucked into Vogel. But we can sit here and talk about Quinn Snyder, and we can talk about Nick Nurse and all that. Those guys aren't going to put up with that kind of crap. Like they're not going to come onto a staff where the Lakers tell them who has to be on their staff, and Kurt Rambis is allowed to sit in on coaches meetings and all these other.
Sure.
So what gives here first? Their desire to control, which means hiring Steve Clifford, who is a different version of Frank Vogel, which is good.
Yes.
Why not? But
Steve Clifford, Terry Stotts, Scott Brooks, those guys.
Those are all Frank Vogel. Or Nick Nurse. What gives here? What do they give up first?
I mean, they haven't shown a great desire to change. I mean, that to back to the point about accountability, right? Earlier is sort of, to me that would be accountability. And I wonder if that, I mean, maybe Rob Pelinka is in between, alchemist readings or whatever he's doing right now, is having moments of real self-eval. I'm sure he's trying, he wants to win, is, self-evaluating and saying maybe this is the adjustment. Maybe I have to go to ownership and I have to tell people to back off. I have to go to ownership and say, if we want these people, we've got to meet them on their terms, not on ours. And I think, look, if they're going to shop in that price range, whether they want to or not, the price range will tell them. That's one of the interesting things about talking to guys who have a ton of options. You know what I mean? And that's sort of another thing. I mean, it wasn't like Ty Lue didn't take the Lakers job and then went and got a head coach. He went and was an assistant with Doc Rivers for a year and stuff like that, and lived off some offset money and, or whatever, but kind of got back into it that way. If you're talking to people Quinn Snyder, who people wonder if he's the heir apparent in San Antonio, right? If you're talking to Nick Nurse, who has a job, who's the czar functionally of Canadian basketball, despite being from Iowa, the Canada of the Midwest. Like, I think like if you look at like, if you know, is like, does he want, like, to your point, like, does he want to come and do it? I mean, Doc is a really interesting person because he does seem to like, look, there are reasons to not want Doc Rivers on board. I will say the things that Doc would go toe to toe with the Rambises. Like, he won't back down from the Rambises. Like, he won't. He, like, if you hire Doc Rivers, to me, like, that would be a sign that the front office is comfortable stepping back, at least initially, in these things. Because
I like the sound of that.
I mean,
because you don't hire, like, Doc Rivers isn't going to do it otherwise.
Then I wonder why you don't have the self-awareness to recognize maybe we need to just change the front office. If you require a coach
our
to
management
stand up
structure,
to
our
us,
process, our
Right.
process is
exactly.
a problem
Like
we should change.
if you're hiring a coach to
I mean,
help
a coach
keep us in
is,
check,
yeah, it's a Band-Aid.
maybe you should just check yourself and then just get the better coach or whatever coach you think would do the best job, as opposed to finding the coach that will save us from ourselves. You know what I mean? Like, just
Yes.
do the
You're
work
saying the Lakers
internally.
need to chickadee check themselves before they
rickety wreck themselves.
I think no, I mean it's look, I mean, that's a fair point, but I mean, I think, right, like, what do we know about human beings is, like, generally speaking, people will do the easier of the two. And I think the easier thing to do here is you just hire a coach and you hope it changes. And look, I don't even know that they view this as a problem. You know, they may not.
I'm pretty confident they don't.
Yeah, they
Very
like
confident.
Like, I mean, I think like the desire to change is like they may just want. So that is what is such an interesting thing. We'll see what they kind of. It is. This is sort of a coward's way out to these questions, but we will know a lot more about their process and a lot more about their thinking 10 days after they hire the coach. You know what I mean? And we see, who do they interview? What were their demands? Who did they land with? Like, you know, if you do hire Quinn Snyder, if you do hire Nick Nurse, you do hire Doc Rivers, you do hire a big name, Jeff Van Gundy. I mean, maybe even Mark Jackson to this extent, like someone who has some juice, right? Like, Mark Jackson has a great job, by the way. You know, he may really want to get back into coaching. And we've seen this with Jeff Van Gundy. Those dudes have great jobs. You know, like, if you hire somebody who has a certain amount of juice, like, you as an organization seemingly are signaling a willing to give a little bit to get more in return. And if you go through those processes and those guys all systematically back out, you hear things like the money was bad, they're trying to put guys on our staff that we don't want, like all of these things then it would seemingly be that they are trying to find someone that you and I may say control, they may say collaborate. You know, someone who can work more together. And that, I think, is sort of fascinating. And that we'll know a lot more in a month or so.
Okay. So, with that in mind, like, all of this gets back to this sort of idea of like the franchise's standing when it comes to attracting players, when it comes to attracting coaches, when, you know, all this. And that was so much of what we were talking about with Frank Vogel and the impact of how he was fired. Rob Pelinka had a very specific quote about that and what the perception of the Lakers is now externally. I want to read it back to you, and then we can talk about that. We'll do it next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, news, including NBA playoffs, which are in full swing, and they are awesome so far. Also, Major League Baseball's underway. If you're still a little bit behind with what's going on with the AL and NL, there are previews up on the site. A lot of good information about the teams to keep your eye on, the ones that could end up the best bets for you going forward. NL West, a lot of choices going on there. BetOnline, your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, including live betting, playoffs, esports, more. So head to the website today, use your mobile device, learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the games start.
So, Andy, before we get into that, you had one more thing you wanted to add.
Yeah, but before we even get into that perception of the Lakers around the league and how it could affect them hiring the coach, how much do you think internally they actually care who the coach is? Because I think that's the biggest reason that they have no consistent ethos in what they seem to want in a coach, and B, that coach has become a revolving door since Phil Jackson is ultimately, I don't think they really care who the coach is. And because I think at the end of the day, what they really think matters is stars and the details underneath the stars, whether you're talking about the way a roster is constructed with role players, whether you're talking about certain details that you pay attention to in building out whatever, or even something like coach, I don't actually think they care that much.
So I'm going to pull this up here just because I need to cheat a little bit. But see, I think they do. I just think that they have a warped sort of sense of what that all means, right? Like, I do think that they care that the person on the sideline is a star in some sense, right? Themselves, right? So, like, if we look at sort of who they've hired and when they hired them, right? So Frank Vogel obviously was a good head coach. Certainly doesn't hit the star thing. But if we go back to Phil Jackson, Mike Brown coming off of, success in Cleveland, right? Bernie Bickerstaff, winningest coach in Lakers history. Mike D'Antoni, star head coach. You go from that, and then you go to Byron Scott, beloved within the organization. Luke Walton. Like, none of these people are Taylor Jenkins either.
Yeah,
okay.
I think
you know what I mean? Like, they are all
Team Dan here.
They're all very name brand in some sense. I mean, the closest to that would have been Luke Walton, right? Who was an assistant and had a lot of success with the Warriors and was viewed, as potentially
Luke was considered a hot hire around the league.
Was a very hot
hire. You fire? We asked Mitch straight up, did you fire Byron as quickly as you did because you thought that Luke would be gone by the time you had an opening? He said yes. Like they moved quick on that.
But then I guess you're sort of confirming, Dan, my theory on this, because my theory has been, unless it is a star, or I guess a star in the Lakers' mind at coach, they don't care, which sort of gets back to their whole, if you are not a star at blank, we don't care. Like, you need to be a star, or else otherwise you are interchangeable in our eyes. And eventually, if these coaches sort of prove themselves to be less than star worthy for whatever reason, probably because the Lakers aren't really thinking that hard about this beyond the surface, you become replaceable.
So I've never tested this theory out, so I'm just going to spitball it on the fly. So hopefully this works. But, like, it isn't wildly dissimilar to the Westbrook situation, by the way, too, in terms of, you get a former star or somebody you think is going to be a star. They are not a star, and then you don't know what to do with them when they are not a star. Then they become sort of expendable. And I do think that it is, and also to even tie it further to the Westbrook thing, you know how hard it is for Westbrook to change, right? Is because he's had amazing success doing things his way. For all of these flaws, dating to the start of, we can go back even further, but, like, if you want to look at the start of Dr. Jerry Buss's ownership of this team, the team has been at its most successful, obviously, when it has had bigger than life superstars who have exerted a lot of control and have been put first in a lot of ways, just by the nature of their stardom. It has been a successful formula for the organization. And look, I think the Lakers in a lot of ways would be, the basketball fans and a lot of people it'd be easier to understand. And certainly when I talk to people about this around the league, like, this comes up a lot, and there is resentment. There's, like, a really healthy resentment, and, like, the steps that, say, the Memphis Grizzlies have to go through organizationally to find success versus the ones the Lakers had to go through to win their last title. Like, right? Like, if you look at that, like, the steps that went into that, right, was, like, they signed LeBron James. They messed up their lead executive quit when no one was paying, like, out of nowhere, when no one was finding, like, and not just lead executive, by the way, Magic Johnson just, like, walks out on the season before. You go into this tumultuous summer. You make the Anthony Davis trade, but people are like, did you really do it right within the cap? Did you leave yourself enough flexibility? You put all your eggs in the Kawhi Leonard basket and kind of get played, by a guy who probably wasn't ever going to come there. So now you're shopping at the very tail end of free agency.
Is that what you think? Because that was my theory all along. My theory was always, is there any star in the league who seems like he would hate being a Laker more than Kawhi Leonard?
And being the third most important Laker, too, seemingly. Like, this was a player. Yeah, it didn't make sense.
I never thought he was coming because of
it never made sense. But, like, look, he was good enough to chase. So they chased him. So then they found themselves in the back end of free agency and they were forced to bargain hunt, and they were forced to be aggressive in all these sort of strange ways, and they hit a ton of home runs, kind of whether it's flukishly or smartly, whatever. But like they definitely like found all these things. And like you talk to these people and they say like, I mean, this turned so quickly for the Lakers, and it wasn't really a lot by their doing. A lot of it was just kind of a combination of good fortune. It wasn't long-term planning necessarily.
Had Danny Green not been waiting for Kawhi himself, they never get Danny.
You know, so I think it is kind of an interesting thing, like to say, like, should the Lakers be more process oriented, you know, and be viewing things on a 5-year, 7-year plan, the way the Grizzlies, so the way that some of these other organizations who don't have their luxuries, or should they use their luxuries? Like,
but
you know,
I reject the binary there, because
I mean, you should do both ideally.
Right. First of all, they're no longer above that stuff, but to some degree, we talked about earlier. They've hired first-time coaches. They've hired, they've had success with things this way. When they won with Showtime, they won with those incredible Hall of Fame players and a roster full of above average role players like Michael Cooper and Robert Horry and Byron Scott and all these guys who are not Hall of Famers, but well above average.
Sure.
Like supporting those guys. And so it wasn't just the Stars. And when they won the title in 2020, it was with the Stars, but also Kyle Kuzma and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and other guys, and Dwight Howard that year. Danny Green, who played at they were above average players, or average in some time, but it wasn't what it was this year, where it was 2 stars, 3 if you count Russ, and marginal NBA players generally behind that.
Totally.
They are wildly concerned about doing things in ways that look like the Lakers shouldn't be doing it. That is a perception that I get of this. Not that they don't want to win, not that they're not interested in what the fans expect. They absolutely do want to do those things, but I think they are very concerned about appearances, and not having to do things that the Lakers shouldn't have to do. Maybe I'm overreacting to a really bad season.
I think there's something to that. And I think there's certainly something to like enjoying, like kind of like the buzz out of an off season where some people, I mean, not everybody certainly, but where some people were looking at this team and say, oh man, like this team's going to win like 68 games. You know, like look at this roster. They've got 14 great players. Well, like functionally, like if you talk to NBA people, like you shouldn't have 14 great players on a team. That's a bad idea. Like you're not going to play 14 guys. Like that breeds a certain level of content, like within your team, like in terms of like the way you build a roster. Like you ideally would have maybe 9 great players and then 6 guys that you're either developing or you can kind of push in here or there, and you've got people on the rise that are coming up as people start to fall. And like I think, that that was a miss, right? Like, and the Lakers did do that, and it happened whether it was organically or whether it was through great strategy. When they won their title, like that roster was more composed, it was more balanced. Ascending like a player like Alex Caruso and Kyle Kuzma, like learning how to be a winning basketball player. While maybe asking other guys to do less over the course of the season than you thought they would originally, like Rajon Rondo. And part of this too, by the way, is just like their financial reality as well, is that when you end up shopping almost entirely at minimum base levels, you're going to get a very specific kind of player. And more often than not, and if you're looking to make the kind of impact the Lakers are going to make, I mean, I think a lot of organizations would talk themselves into people like Kent Bazemore in those situations. A guy who's played, who's contributed on good teams, like, and he's going to make the minimum, like, great, sign him up. He'll make sense here. And he didn't. But like they had a lot of those guys. And I think that it's just, I mean, this is sort of the challenge of the offseason, the challenge of the future of the Lakers in a lot of ways, is that as they've put themselves in LeBron James, Anthony Davis, and like this year too, Russell Westbrook sort of like control. Like, can you fill in these problems in the back half? Can you build for the future while simultaneously being forced to deal with the most win now situation of all time. And LeBron James, like as win now of a situation as you can be in, when you've already cashed in, by the way, a lot of the things that would help you win now have already been cashed in to get to this point. It's just a very difficult time for this front office. Like their job is very hard. It's easy to criticize them because they've made a lot of this happen, but like it is very hard. Like they're in a very hard spot organizationally. And if they come out of this summer with an improved roster, a good head coach, and a credible chance, again, maybe not to win a title, but a credible chance to threaten, like that'll be, I mean, Laker fans should be thrilled with that.
That would be an amazing accomplishment. And
I'll be
stoked.
stoked.
For one, am absolutely not confident. So we'll see how that goes. But I want to be proven wrong because I don't want to do this again. This year sucked, and I don't want to do it again. Dan Woike,
we'll make it fun. We'll make it fun somehow.
Dan Woike of the LA Times. Thanks so much for giving us this much time. This was fun. We really appreciate it.
This was fun. Yeah, this is, like I said, it is a fun conversation to have because I have no idea what the answers are.
Well, neither do we, but hopefully they do. Appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, our thanks to Dan Woike again of the LA Times. Great writer. Again, go back and listen to Wednesday's episode if you haven't already. Just a lot of really great insight. I particularly love the stuff of him talking about Russ and just getting into what it was like to cover him and how impactful Russ's personality was on the team. Next, Andy, though, all of these themes we've talked about, whether it's the coaching search, accountability, Westbrook, personnel, there's a common thread that runs through this in terms of the Lakers trying to repair stuff for next year. And let's talk about that next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by Built Bar. Eating smart, but also eating enjoyably. It has never tasted better. You're going to be able to treat yourself without feeling guilty with Built Bar. If you've not tried their puffs, for example, you are missing out on one of Built Bar's best tasting bars. They are the first ever. I had no idea this was even possible to do. Science is amazing. Protein infused marshmallow, fluffy, marshmallowy. They're not just a protein bar, they're a treat, and they are covered in 100% real chocolate. Great flavors like cinnamon churro, coconut marshmallow, banana cream pie. They're all going to feel like your new favorite. It's going to be impossible to choose. And you know what? You don't have to. Don't bother. Just use that energy towards eating the damn puffs. And unlike a typical candy bar, which is like 200 to 300 calories of just junk, most Built Bars, they're only 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, but 17 grams of protein, and that's the good stuff. There's always cool, unique, interesting flavor combinations. You're never going to feel bored with Built Bars. So go to Built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15, get 15% off your order. Again, promo code LOCKED15, 15% off at Built.com.
All right, so we covered just tons of ground with Dan, and it's interesting. Like I did Spectrum on this week with that's the Lakers TV station, their studio show, and we talked about a lot of some similar stuff, and what's going to happen with Russ, and what's going to happen with the coaching search, and what all these different things. Malik Monk's role going forward. And between that conversation and the one we had with Dan, Andy, it really comes down to me, like the first thing the Lakers have to do. And I'm not saying there's, plan, and that's they got to figure out what they are. What are you next year? What is your goal for next year? And that might mean trying to make the playoffs. It might mean trying to reset for the future. I don't know what the right answer is, and they can pivot if the options are there. But they got to have an idea of what they want because it impacts everything from roster construction to who you hire as the coach and all that stuff.
Well, beyond the idea of what you want to be next season, you need to figure out who are you realistically. Like, who are you before you even figure out what you want to do with that? And I say that because there's a difference between wanting to be a championship contender and declaring championship aspirations. And this is an organization that loves to present itself as always being in championship mode. Like this is the standard by which we measure ourselves.
It's the Mamba mentality manifested in a franchise.
Yes, exactly. And that's great. Except in reality, you cannot always be a championship contender. It's not the way the world works. And the Lakers got themselves into trouble, for example, during the period where Kobe was post Achilles and was not the same player. He wasn't even a safe bet to always be on the floor. And any other player, not being Kobe and what he meant to the Lakers, and I think also any other organization not being the Lakers, would have recognized we need to go into a pretty open, if not even aggressive rebuild, because this is where we are right now. We've been built around a once in a few generations type talent like Kobe. And we never want to forget what he means to this organization, and we never will. But the reality is we cannot contend like this. And the Lakers instead went out of their way to project championship aspirations and felt like it was disrespectful to Kobe to be in rebuild mode with him there. And what ended up happening was they had these really half-baked plans of chasing 8 seeds that didn't work out, and they fell ass backward in the lottery picks that saved them from themselves. You can only do bad plans that end up working out despite your worst intentions so many times. So whatever the Lakers want to do moving forward, first they need to take an honest assessment of, can we do this moving forward?
It's a good point. And you look at it, and I think I'm more comfortable with the idea of even understanding this isn't really even my point, but of extending LeBron, of keeping the 2 stars that they have, understanding that there is a risk those guys may not be on the floor. It's hard to replace them, and I don't even know what their relative value is. I don't know what you get if you put LeBron and AD on the trade market. Maybe my opinion would change if I had a better idea of that. But to your point, it's okay, let's assume that LeBron and AD are back next year. Do we think they can stay healthy? That's step 1 in terms of assessing how good can we be.
And they should have a better idea of that than either one of us.
Correct. The second step, though, is even if you assume that those guys can be healthy and you're fairly confident, we'll throw the darts and, everybody gets hurt. But, if the stars align and those guys are available for the playoffs and we have enough wins to get in them, we can be okay. Can you build a good enough supporting cast? Because the rest of the team wasn't close. And I think we are probably past the idea of LeBron and AD can carry anything, deep into the playoffs. No, there needs to be something there. The next question is Westbrook. What I think there's a possibility that everybody with a second year can come back with a little bit of a different perspective, a little bit better idea of what we're going to do here or not. I'm not saying it will happen. I'm just saying it's possible.
I don't disagree, actually.
Right. It's one more year for Russ to kind of get closer to maybe a better understanding of who he is now and all that. Again, not guaranteed, possible.
Nor is it necessarily ideal. Either one of us is saying.
I think if you ask, the Lakers would prefer to move on from Westbrook, and Westbrook would prefer to move on from the Lakers. Both of everybody can make that happen. The Lakers can give up a ton of stuff to get rid of Westbrook. Westbrook can make himself a free agent. He's not going to do that, and I hope the Lakers don't do something really stupid in an effort just to unload him.
I agree.
But those things
that is a dangerous thing that
you're right.
Could potentially do.
But you're right. Well, and what got me thinking about it in terms of our conversation with Dan is all of these things too then impact your choice of coach, don't they? Do you bump if you think Westbrook's going to be around next year and you got to make that work, but you're still in as much of a win now mode as you can be? Do you bump Scotty Brooks closer to the front of the line because he has a really good relationship with Russell Westbrook? Do you think Doc Rivers could fix that a little bit more because he is such a strong personality with a pretty good track record of working around
until he feuds with them?
Right, until he doesn't. They need a plan A, they need a plan B, they need a plan C, and it all, you're right, starts with, realistically speaking, how good can we be? And could we be really, really good? Legitimately, really, really good. If we do some stuff that compromises the future a little bit more, but legitimately, not like you say, cosmetically, or performatively makes us look better for next year, but really turns us into a contender, I'm okay with that. I think most fans would be, but man, it requires honesty that they just haven't had over the last year.
Well, for example, when you talked about the possibility of Russ coming back, and would that, because Scott Brooks has been linked to this job, he's been linked to this job in the past because the Lakers change coaches like every few years. With Scott Brooks, just as an example, like that is specific to what we were talking about, but I think it applies to whatever. You don't hire Scott Brooks because you think he can be a Russ whisperer, because Russell Westbrook is going to be on this team one more year max. That's it. He is, unless you turn this into a longer problem, he is a 1-year problem at the most. Do you think Scott Brooks is a really good coach? If the answer to that is yes, then okay, bump him to the front of the line, see what happens with the interview. And if you want to hire him, hire him. You can't just bring in a guy that you're not really that sure about, but he fits for LeBron. Like, you need to find a guy that you think could actually be a good coach for this team moving forward. Let's just go crazy. Let's say 5 years. Let's say you actually keep your coach for 5. Let's go nuts. Like, you keep your coach for half a decade.
5 American years? Are we doing, how are we measuring this, dog years?
5 years by a standard lunar calendar. And I'm not saying that LeBron's input shouldn't be weighed and listened to. Of course it should. Like, that's the way this stuff works. You should listen to LeBron. You should listen to Anthony Davis. That's the way good organizations go about these hirings. But what you can't do is hire somebody you really don't think is a good idea, but you're trying to just hedge a couple years. That's a bad idea, regardless of who they go after.
Right. And my last thing on this, and we'll go. It also doesn't have to be all or nothing. Deciding that next year is not going to be an easy one to thread the needle and win a title, but if we do something really stupid, we're actually going to put ourselves in a hole that could take a decade to get out of, is not the same as saying we're out of the LeBron James business. You can go to LeBron and say, we're going to put a competitive team on the floor. We're going to, we're going to do a better job surrounding you with youth. We're going to have a better plan. You and AD will still be here. Russ may or may not be here. And we think we can be competitive. I don't know if we can get us past Phoenix in a year, but we might be able to do it in 2. Can you hang with us for a little bit? It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be drastic decisions in one, but they need a plan and they need to figure out what they are and what they're going to be. I'd love to continue this into Friday's show because there's a ton of different directions that it can go. Thanks again to Dan Woike for 2 shows worth of stuff. Locked On Lakers on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribing there to get the podcast a little bit early. We'll see everybody Friday.